Hello, this is Clarence Moye with Awards Daily here with Joe Walker, editor of the film Dune, which was #1 at the box office this past weekend. Joe, very nice to meet you. And before we get started, I have to congratulate you. It's hot off the presses. It's just been announced that Dune has officially been greenlit for a sequel. Everybody's anxiously anticipating it. I'm sure you have been as well.
It's out. It's out.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I got a message from Denis this morning, and I told him I've already packed my parasol.
All right. Well, let's get right into it. So this is your your fourth time collaborating with Denis Villeneuve. What is it about that partnership, that relationship, that keeps you coming back and working with him again and again?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time together, and it's that's a real joy for me. As you know, he's a delightful man to be with, and it's you build up a period of over a period of 4 films, you build up a considerable amount of trust, and I'd follow him over a cliff. Sometimes there are ideas where you don't know quite where it's going to go, but you just follow them because in the past it's worked many times, and we often have to start something by saying, bad idea, what if? And then it carries on from there. Just ways out of problems and little things that we need to solve. But I think a large part of that was, the first film we did together, Sicario, was the way it was conceived and shot and prepared. It was very much like doing fine cabinetry in it. And in a way, with Roger Deakins' photography, it's very much as an editor, you're sort of going, but, maybe have you thought about doing it this way? Just, for your own, to soothe yourself, you
Right.
kind of come up with a different way of doing things. On Arrival, it was all scripts. That script was a fantastic page turner, but there was always a little risk involved in it. Will people fully be on board the kind of twist? And so there was a fair amount of readjustment to do on that. That took a lot of rethinking, remanufacturing of material. So we learned a lot on that film. And I kind of felt like having also grown with him in terms of VFX is very important. There was probably low 3 figures VFX shots in Sicario, and above, certainly over, I think 11 or 1200 VFX shots in Dune. I could be wrong on that. I stand to be corrected, but it certainly felt like a lot.
Sure.
So it's great that we went step by step together, and I've learned a lot over those 4 films.
Right. Well, that growth and collaboration certainly had to have helped while you were editing Dune, because I believe that you did have to edit it within the pandemic, correct? You were not in the same room. You were physically separated.
Yes. I mean, when the pandemic hit, everything closed down. And after a little period of adjustment when we were trying to figure out how long that would last, I mean, I know we all kind of kept working. I mean, we were among, we were all in garden sheds and spare bedrooms scattered around the city. And, Denny at one point had to return to Montreal, and we continued working through, online software, which was, there are some great advantages to that. I mean, it was, for example, when you've cut a scene, you're showing it to your director for the first time. Normally their face is actually hidden from you. You're only seeing a profile. This, I could actually sort of see the scene on his face, which is a very kind of direct and honest way of working out whether an idea works or not.
Right.
But after a while, I think, it became frustrating not to be in the same room. And eventually, he flew back to LA, and we carried on in the same room together. It just feels like sometimes you're making music together and you have to be in the same room.
Sure. So you talked about, what you had built together with Sicario, and then the necessity of Arrival, the sort of the plot driving, ensuring that, your editing could deliver or help deliver that twist that happens in Arrival. What were some of the blueprints that you had in mind for Dune? What sort of challenges did you know that you had to set out and achieve initially, and how did that influence your editing?
I mean, like a kind of big global thing to say is it's just sort of trying to kind of make a very rhythmic, very musically rhythmic piece out of the whole
Mm.
thing. And as in editing, you're sort of at the still point of the turning world. You've got tentacles reaching out into all these other amazing departments: VFX department, sound department, music department, and combining that with the photography and the performances most, principally. And so, sometimes it was a kind of collaboration to try and kind of to make a rhythm. And you never really knew where that rhythmic element would come from. It could be, the raising of an eyebrow by Stephen Henderson, in the middle of a scene. That's the kind of rhythmic element that I'm playing with. Or, the pounding of a thumper on the desert sand. Or, it doesn't have to come from only music. It comes from all sources. That was the kind of global thing. But I think in a more profound way for this story, for Dune, it felt that it was important to kind of balance those intimate moments with the epic. There's some very large scale, massive stuff. But there's also, you wanted to kind of preserve time in the edit to be able to examine the smallest detail, whether that's a beetle on Duncan Idaho's hand, which sort of is repeated with poignancy later in the film, or one of my favorite shots, which I love talking about, is the shot of Lady Jessica, where they're about to move from the planet and everything's being packed away in crates, and her servants are there to sort of say goodbye. And it's just a shot of the back of her neck. And I always feel, Denis really has a talent for those kind of brainstemmy shots, something that works not on a front lobal way, not in a verbal way. You don't see the front of her face, you don't see Leto join her, but you see his hand touch the back of her neck. And it's such a sensory thing. We all know what that feels like, to either give or receive. And the expression she has of such trust in Leto is something, it just really speaks volumes. And for me, the edit was always trying to kind of sustain that level of detail, especially in Frank Herbert's world, which is such a kind of detailed world. It's fractal in its depth of imagination.
So you kind of referenced this before, but there's, obviously the beginning of Dune is all about the world building and the politics and the relationship building and setting up the characters, and then transitioning over to Arrakis. And then, of course, there's the massive epic scale of the back end of that, where there's lots of battles and sequences. And, tell me, obviously there are differences in the way you edit those scenes and those two halves. But was there trying to sort of a narrative thread that you wanted to try to carry through both styles of filmmaking, or both, types of action versus the drama?
I think you're always just, the most important thing is to make it a compelling story and to care about the characters at the center of it. So the kind of crucial things, the things that we lavished time on, were getting the kind of central relationships really spick and span. I mean, Jessica and Paul, I think, is the kind of key relationship in the thing. And we spent a long time working on the tent sequence and how the discovery of the ring, which I won't spoil for people who haven't seen it, but it's like, I think it's really beautiful the way that it's intercut, and the two events sort of seem to happen in an overlapping fashion. But trying to kind of finesse that took months. Actually, some action sequences, I'd say the fight sequence at the end, for example, it never really changed, not from the day after it was filmed. It was just really well done. And Denis, thank God, is a director who doesn't try and change things that are really working. And as long as they're really working, that's something we don't have to worry about. We've got plenty else to look at here.
Right.
But, it's my general approach as well. It's maybe not the most sensible approach with an Oscars campaign in mind, but it's to keep out the way. It's to keep out the way. So hopefully you don't feel me like interfering. I'm not in the way. I'm not trying to kind of raise my hand and say hello. I'm just kind of in keeping momentum and and driving you through rhythmically a scene. And I'd give an example of that so that we're not just talking about it in an abstract sense. I think it's little decisions like Stilgar's first moment. Javier Bardem arrives at court, and there's this magic moment that he did in his performance where he arrives at the table, and there's a nervous silence, and he sizes everybody up, and then after quite a pause, spits on the table, and everybody rushes to blades,
Right.
unsheathed swords, and it's kind of such a phenomenal little tense pause in silence.
Mhm.
And the temptation, because there's a room full of brilliant actors. There's Timothée Chalamet, there's Stephen Henson, there's Jason Momoa, there's Josh Brolin, and of course Oscar. Oscar. All of them together. There's a million reasons to cut somebody else, and say Paul recognizes him, or that Tufa Hawat is anxious about the diplomacy. But it's just, for me, the right decision was just hold on that moment and let it play out, and enjoy the deliciousness of what Javier Bardem was doing.
Right. Well, I would think, I know you were joking, but I would think that there is an inherent challenge in taking something like Dune, especially with the Frank Herbert novel and the complexities and the detail within it. Then, of course, Denis' screenplay, translating that and his direction to try to keep that, all the pieces of all that together so that it makes narrative sense. I mean, that I would think that a lot of that does lie with the editor, in terms of making sure that all these scenes flow correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time with Denny and trying to figure that out. I mean, I think a lot of it was a screenwriting challenge too. Its beginnings are particularly tough, and especially when you have to set up the spice, the Fremen, the Harkonnens, and you've got a lot of catching up to do with something that's set 20,000 years in the future. I mean, if this was set in Brooklyn 2021, be very brief.
It'd be very
But,
different.
it'd be very, very different. I mean, I was really fond of an idea that came quite late, which was, and it was born from a kind of sense that we didn't establish the Sardaukar until halfway into the film, this elite fighting force that works for the Emperor. And we felt that they needed a sort of presence. And Denny came up with this fantastic verse at the beginning, and it was at one stage a little longer, but I'm really glad that it stayed in some form, which is actually pre-logo, which is kind of quite unusual. You just hear this hideous, aggressive voice, blood-curdling voice.
Yes.
And, hopefully that pays off a little later in the film where you hear that voice again. But it was like it was a really arresting way to start the film.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember the line. It's something like dreams are messages from the future or something like that. And
Right.
I don't know, it was like these things evolved over time. I'm glad. I hope we got it right.
One thing that I wondered, is there an inherent challenge? I know a lot of this was filmed, or maybe all of it was filmed using large format cameras ready for that IMAX screen. Is there an inherent challenge in editing for both something that's going to show on an IMAX screen versus something that's going to show, in a standard theater, not even counting something that shows on HBOMax on TV? Do you have to consider choices that you make in terms of the format of the camera or the film stock?
Absolutely. They shot a generous amount of IMAX in this. I mean, I think it was an hour of material is IMAX. It's a very large proportion was shot and intended in that format. And I initially had an anxiety about the times where you go between the formats. When you go between a full height 1:4:3 and a 2:3:9 aspect ratio, I had some anxiety about how smoothly we could do that. I mean, Denny and Greg had designed these amazing shots that help you flow between one aspect ratio and the other. For example, there's a moment where Paul and Jessica run out into the open air and head towards an ornithopter, and by coming up through shadow, the shadow evolves into a full screen and it raises the height for you. So there are some very clever ways they'd anticipated that issue and sort of rejoiced in it. For me, we cut the film originally, the very first fine cut I think we did. So the first couple of months of work in the director's cut period was IMAX, and we checked it on a big screen to make sure to see what it felt like. And I gained confidence actually that, and by seeing other IMAX movies, I know I think so much of that is peripheral that you accept the formats changing much more than you think you might when you're looking at it on a small screen.
Right.
So it was kind of a little bit of experimentation, to be honest. And sometimes it's just a crude technical thing of some things need to be framed differently in order to kind of get the information across in both formats. But I wouldn't say it was a huge challenge. It was interesting
Mhm.
to see it in both formats.
Talked a little bit about the sequence with Javier Bardem's character and making those editing choices to deliver that narrative. What were some of the more challenging moments that sort of had your head scratching as to how you were going to solve a problem in particular?
Actually, there's so much film to think about. I'm trying to kind of
It's not a short movie.
it's not. My brain is going all over the place. I mean, I
Sure.
haven't had enough coffee to answer that one directly. There's there are so many places where I mean, for example, the voice, the idea of the voice, that the Gom Jabbar scene, I think, is something that we spent a lot of time tirelessly trying to kind of investigate different ways of doing that. And that was a real, I described the team I'm working with as it feels sometimes a bit like Frank Zappa's touring band, very well rehearsed. We've done quite a few films together. I've worked with Hans since 1988 was
Oh
the
wow.
first time I worked with him. Yeah, back in London when the last show he did before leaving for the States. So we worked together, and sometimes it's a scene like the Gom Jabbar scene, where Paul is forced to
Yes.
put his hand into a box as a test
Mhm.
by the Reverend Mother, played by Charlotte Rampling, to see whether he can control his animal instincts. Because if he doesn't, he'll die. It's too risky to put him on the planet and proceed. That they'll put him down there and then, while his mother is outside, knowing full well that she's brought him to this point. So it's kind of a very tense scene, and in a funny way, it's a bit. It makes always used to make me think a little bit like the Sicarios, the scene on the bridge, which is sort of strangely tense,
Right.
very tense scene, but everybody's static. And in this one, nobody's moving. I mean, Paul is trying not to move,
Mhm.
and but a lot of it was trying to fix the voice at the beginning to show that Paul is learning the voice. He's in the starter slopes,
Right.
which is very good to sort of establish for later when he has to use it in earnest to save himself. But at that point, in the early breakfast scene, you've seen that he hasn't kind of quite got it. And
Right.
that's all a question of timing. We came up with this idea that you'd hear the of the command, but then hear the voices a little later. Whereas when the Reverend Mother does it, it's used with maximum efficiency. And it's, that was made up of many elements. I mean, you hear Charlotte Rampling's voice, you hear other voices like Jean Gilpin, and we even recorded Marianne Faithfull as a
Mhm.
voice, which it gives me a kind of thrill because I'm fairly sure Marianne Faithfull and Charlotte Rampling were drinking buddies back in Kings Road in the 60s. But anyway, that's a sort of side note. But all of those things, the timing of that was very critical. And, it's beautiful the way that they shot that moment of kind of pulling away from Paul with the lights going down and going out of focus. And Denny's just recently talked in an analysis of this scene. And he expresses extremely beautifully how, the thought that went into that. But then, the rhythm between the Reverend Mother and Paul, that took a lot of figuring out. It was a very early dailies. I think it was one of the first things they shot, and it was momentous. Seeing there's one particular moment in the dailies where you saw Paul's inner, this sort of nasty, devilish kind of quality in him rise for the first time. And it's so true to the book as well. He feels a power at that point that something is revealed, the Kwisatz Haderach. That was kind of a combination of performance, but also the amazing sort of work of Hans. He gave us some abstract tracks, a suite of music, and we found this little vocal lick that an amazing singer, Laura Kotler, had recorded in her wardrobe in New York during the pandemic. And but it just expressed that darkness that sort of surfaces at that moment. All of that, that there was a lot of to and fro. And sometimes, I'd send a cut to Denny, and sometimes he would send back a cut as well, and collaborate in that way and say, hey, look, what about this? And it just went on like that for quite a time.
What's really interesting is that the two scenes that you've described in some great detail are both interpersonal, political, very tense moments, not necessarily those climactic, large-scale battle sequences that happen toward the end of the film. I find that really interesting, that that's what would give you a little bit more anxiety, or a little bit more of an additional challenge to get the beats of those intimate moments right.
Well, you have these kind of huge set pieces, and often the real work on those happened before they were filmed. I mean, in the case of, for example, there's a set piece where you first go out into the desert, and Paul Atreides is sort of his first view of the worm. He's with Liet Kynes in an ornithopter, and that was the very first thing I worked on 2 weeks before the shoot. You have first of all a storyboard. You have a script and a storyboard, but then they've done previs, but previs doesn't often give you a true sense of time, and you have to kind of have a better concept of what that looks like. And I use every dumb trick in the book, sound effects, or my assistants doing the voices, or AI voices from the internet, if I just to show what it's going to feel like, because that becomes a very key discussion document for all of the departments who are then going to shoot the actual footage. And that was in multiple passes. Some of it shot in Budapest, some of it shot in Jordan, some of it shot in Abu Dhabi, and and much of it, the worm, created in CGI. So it's a question of working the detail of that. Actually, a lot of the hard work on that scene, the heavy lifting, was done before they even shot it.
So my closing question for you is this. So when Denis was approached, before the official sequel had been greenlit, he was approached about what would the sequel look like, what would it feel like, and he said it would be more cinematic, to use an exact quote. What does that mean to you? What have you already started talking about what that the rhythms of the second film would look like?
No idea at all. I'm really excited to, I hope, find out.
Excellent.
I only heard today that we're on board, so it's kind of I know that there's a script that's been written, and I'm dying to read it, of course. I mean, if we know the book, it's I'm sure it's preoccupied with a large desert battle.
Right.
I don't know whether what he means by cinematic means that perhaps a lot that has been established in book one means that you can relax a bit in terms of expositional detail. We had to kind of try and effortlessly, or at least appear effortlessly, get you up to date with what a Mentat is, with what a Bene Gesserit is, and what the Empire is, and the Harkonnens. I mean, it's many factions that are complicated to describe. And in a, is it 800-page book? I can't quite remember. It's something like that. You have plenty of time. Right. In a 2.5-hour film, you've got none. So, I wonder whether that's what he means by more cinematic. That maybe we don't have to be as verbal.
Right.
But I'm only guessing. I've got no better idea than you, my friend.
Excellent. Well,
finding out.
We'll find out together then. All right. Well, Joe, thank you so much for the time. Best of luck to you in the season ahead, and congratulations on the weekend, and really great work.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Nice to talk to you, Clarence.
Good to talk to you too. Take care.